Within the Walls by Lux Noctis. Alistair stared intently at the oil-painted crow. It hung from the wall in its dusty olive frame. The bird's likeness had been rendered so perfectly, its feathers seemed to capture light from an unseen source beyond the scope of the image. Its beady eye stared back at him. So lifelike was its approximation that, for a second, he could have sworn he saw it move. A sudden loud ring broke the bird's hold over him. It was the bell on the counter. The two guests that stood in front of it came into focus. "Aren't you forgetting something?" a portly woman asked him. Her dangerously slender husband with a gray pencil mustache stood meekly at her side. Alistair gaped blankly, seemingly unable to grasp the meaning of the words. "Our room key." The lady smiled in a good-natured manner. Her American accent softened each element in her sentence, every syllable flowing smoothly into the next. "Oh, of course," Alistair replied, the gears in his mind finally beginning to turn. His Scottish twang contrasted starkly with his customer's sweeping sounds. He tugged open a dark oak drawer and began rummaging through the sets of keys. A hand fell upon the key to room 7. "I've decided to upgrade you to our finest room, Mr. or Mrs. Cook, at no extra charge, of course." Alistair's soft, weather-beaten face stretched into a smile. Mr. Cook flinched as his wife squeaked gleefully. "Well, that's just wonderful! I can't wait to go check it out." Mrs. Cook snatched the key away from the Scotsman's doughy palm. "Come on, George," she said, jabbing her husband in the ribs with her elbow. He immediately grabbed their suitcases. "Would you two like a hand with those?" Alistair asked, looking a little concerned for George's safety. "No, we're fine," Sylvia Cook stated, waving her flabby arm dismissively. She headed up the stairs. Her skeletal husband trembled beneath the weight of his cargo. He shot Alistair a look that told him poor George might have just considered death a merciful alternative. The ancient staircase creaked uneasily as the frail old man struggled his way up the mountainous flight. After an uncomfortably long time, he finally disappeared from view. Alistair smirked to himself. Manners had kept his face stern, right up until the guests had left his presence. The smirk swiftly turned into a frown when he considered the fact that the Cooks were his only guests. Business had been incredibly slow, and it was gradually bleeding him dry. He sighed wearily to himself, glancing around the entrance to his guest house. It was his pride and joy, but it had fallen into a somewhat sorry state. As Alistair mused, his ear picked up a faint melody coming from the room behind him. He stepped through into a shambles of an office. It looked as though it had been frozen in time many years ago. The whole building was seemingly stuck in the past. Battered old guest books, full of the signatures of previous customers, were spread haphazardly on shelving, tables, and floors alike. Gas lighting cast elongated shadows that danced across the walls. As he strode across the ancient floorboards, they strained beneath his weight. The haunting melody grew louder as he approached the sturdy door to the storage closet. He turned the black iron key that was always left in the lock. He inched the door open, and the music became clear as day. Sat atop the pile of long-forgotten coats left by guests who had never returned for them, the music box stood. The headless dancer twirled infinitely, bathed in shadow, moving to her never-ending melody. He ducked low and reached inside, removing the old box as a pang of sorrow struck his heart. The music box had belonged to his wife. He hadn't seen the thing for well over a year. Hadn't heard that music since before the illness took her from him. The box's incessant chime only brought him pain. He snapped it shut and ran a worn-out hand across the gold vines embedded in its ebony surface. A sudden thump startled him, coming from the closet. He poked his head back inside curiously. Nothing. Then, the sound of movement to his left, and the soft crackle of falling debris. It seemed to be coming from inside the wall. Alistair placed his palm on the cold stone and traced his touch along where the noise seemed to originate. Whatever it was seemed to notice his presence, then darted furiously away. The room was finally silent once more. The Gentile Scotsman wondered what it could have been. He considered a terrifying notion. Rats. That was the last thing he needed with things going the way they were. He groaned to himself and hoped it would be nothing quite so sinister. His thoughts returned to the box, and how it had gotten to be where it was. And stranger yet, how had it been opened? Even this thought was quickly replaced by a deep emptiness. He slumped in a rickety chair, dropped his head into his hands, and allowed himself to wallow in misery. She was never coming back. Alistair's sleep was restless. He was plagued by memories that made drifting deeper into dreams impossible. Every blink seemed to throw him forward in time, yet he felt like he hadn't switched off for a single moment. His eyes flew open as dust caught in his throat, causing him to cough and sputter uncontrollably. Moonlight, just enough to see by, filtered through his grimy window pane. Its beams highlighted the falling matter. The ceiling above him seemed to groan. A tiny crack formed in the paintwork above his head. As the low creak moved, the crack spread along with it. The gaslight hanging above shuddered, causing the glass to cling noisily. Alistair leapt from his bed, his pale and sagging body jerking into motion. He followed the sounds above, keeping his eyes fixed high. It passed out into the hallway. Momentarily, he considered returning to the relative comfort beneath the covers, shutting his eyes and leaving the mysterious happening unsolved. He could not, though. Before he could willingly make a decision, his hand was on the door's cold brass handle. Something was pulling him forward, an invisible and immeasurable force. He pushed the door open. It whined in protest. His feet touched down on the musty carpet of the second-floor hallway. With each muted step down the darkened corridor, a familiar melody seemed to rise. He passed closed-off and empty rooms, and felt remarkably alone. A dim light flickered ahead of him, creeping through the tiny gap between the door and its frame at the end of the hall. He longed to stop, to turn around and retreat to the safety of his bed. However, with each timid stride, the melody grew louder still, and his power to resist diminished ever further. As he reached the door, Alistair's heart thundered in his chest. Incapable of turning away, he attempted to peek through the opening. He could see nothing. Before he had the chance to think, he found himself pushing his way inside. A flickering candle was the source of light, and before it in the claustrophobic room stood a slender woman, dressed all in white. The face reflected in the bathroom mirror made his blood run cold. It was his wife, eyes closed, the very picture of serenity. The door behind him slammed shut. "Maria?" Alistair spoke softly. Innumerable copies of Maria's silhouette seemed to twist and twirl on the walls around him. The figure did not respond. Alistair's mouth became as dry as old bone. His bare body shivered in the icy cold. Breath turned into frost in the air as he exhaled. He reached forward with a trembling hand, his eyes never leaving the motionless face of his former love reflected back at him. She looked so much younger than she had in her final years. Her stillness reminded him of an open casket. His outstretched fingers were less than an inch from her. Then it happened. All at once, a deafening low-pitched drone drowned out the moving chimes. The eyelids of the static figure peeled back, and the mouth opened wide. Viscous black tar poured from each orifice in congealed lumps. Alistair stumbled backwards and fell leaden upon the tiled ground. The candle flickered, shifting the whole room momentarily into an impenetrable darkness. The face was upon him then, staring right at his own. He cried out, but it was impossible to hear over the deep thrum of the noise that enveloped all others. He felt the vile, rancid substance fall upon his exposed skin. The bathroom door swung open, and in the same instant, the candle ceased to burn. A wiry man stood, clutching a candle of his own. "Are you all right down there?" Mr. Cook croaked, his wrinkles deepened by the flickering flame. When the sun arose, its light was smothered by a thick and heavy fog. Alistair hadn't gotten a wink of sleep since the incident in the bathroom. He talked himself into believing that it was a night terror, some kind of delusion, nothing of substance. Through bleary eyes, he dropped a fresh egg into a hot pan.
"You damn near gave me a heart attack last night,"
George chuckled in good humor.
"Prone to sleepwalking?"
"Aye, it's not unheard of."
"Well, at least I know that now. If I run into you in the halls again tonight, it'll be less of a shock. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like the whole historical vibe you got going on here, but I'll be damned if it don't make things a little unsettling when night comes around,"
George croaked.
You get used to it, and besides, you'll struggle to find another place like this anywhere in the world,"
Alistair replied, in a weary attempt to keep the conversation flowing.
"Well, that's for certain."
George smiled, and then paused for a beat.
"Don't suppose I could trouble you for some bacon with those eggs, could I?"
"It would be my pleasure." The owner of the grand guest house gave a quick nod. The hungry old man offered a soft pat on the shoulder in appreciation, then swiftly left the kitchen. Alistair prodded at the eggs absent-mindedly. The sound was like static. Fat splattered his yellowing apron as he lit another of the stove's gas hobs and placed a fresh pan upon it. He added a splash of oil, and a loud hiss filled the room. He stepped over to the icebox to retrieve the cuts of meat his guests had requested. As the box opened, a single musical note seemed to ring out. Alistair leaped back in horror. He collided with a towering shelf, sending decorative glassware tumbling to the ground. He approached the box again, against his better judgment. When he peered inside, masses of writhing flesh squirmed upon the ice. They were colored with deep reds and putrid, infected-looking yellows. Bile rose in his throat, and the stench of death overwhelmed his senses.
"Is everything all right in there?"
George yelled, sounding concerned as he approached. Alistair slammed the lid of the icebox closed as the old man entered.
"Yes, everything's fine. I'm just a little accident-prone today, it would seem."
Alistair glanced over his shoulder. Still crouched by the icebox, he could hear the wiggling monstrosities within. He prayed that George could not.
"Jesus, you really did a number on these, huh?"
George mumbled, eyeing the shattered glass spread across the kitchen floor.
"I'll help you clean this up." No, it's quite all right."
Alistair stood.
"My mess. I'll clean it up."
He sighed as he retrieved an ancient-looking dustpan and brush from under the sink.
"Well, at least let me give you a hand with the breakfast."
George reached for the icebox.
"No, don't you,
Alistair began, but it was too late.
"Honestly, it's no trouble. You need to relax a little, my friend. I can whip up bacon with the best of them, I assure you."
George held the frozen bacon aloft and winked. The crow's feet around his eyes momentarily became deepest chasms. With that, the safety of the day seemed to dissipate. Alistair began to consider the notion that he might be losing his grip on reality. He needed rest. Surely that would be the cure. But something would not let him sleep. Over the following days, he continued to hear the scuttling feet from within the walls, to see things that he was certain could not be. As sleepless night followed sleepless night, the world itself seemed to take on a warped, twisted quality. The sense of the surreal began to permeate the old guest house, still isolated by the dense fog. To Alistair, the walls were in a perpetual motion, fluid, like the rippling of gentle waves, lapping silently at icy shores. All sound became distant, as though he were drowning beneath the surface of that same frigid water. All that is, except for the music, which seemed to haunt him whenever he tried to snatch a moment of respite. The instant he closed his eyes, the music would return, and along with it came paranoia. His guests noticed nothing out of the ordinary. They went about their business, occasionally disappearing for a few hours, becoming hazy, distorted figures as they disappeared into the mist. It was in these moments that Alistair felt at his most vulnerable, and he feared that what lurked within the walls might smell his weakness, might taste his fear in the air. After 5 days, he was convinced something was stalking him, and whatever it was, it had to be the cause of his misery. Alistair was alone, and a daze he wiped down the front desk with a dirty rag. It felt soft and pliable. What he knew was solid wood seemed to give beneath his hand. It had been 6 days since he had gotten any sleep. The grainy surface appeared to twist and tangle itself between his outstretched fingers. He clumsily snatched his hand away from the dark oaken tendrils. His eyes watched them retreat, but saw little. The sound of a cawing crow inflamed his otherwise dull senses. He spun around and stared blearily at his beloved oil painting. The crow's unblinking eye stared back. Alistair struggled to focus, mouth hanging open vacantly. Every blink seemed to diminish his already muddy view. He staggered forward and clutched the painting's frame. Soot-like dust clung to his palms. He squinted at the bird on the canvas. For a second the image became clear. The bird's head jerked towards him. All at once the malicious melody burst into existence again, this time at an ear-shattering volume. And countless shadowy crows flew from the canvas in a torrent of black feathers. Alistair was thrown off his feet. He crashed painfully on his aged hip. The birds dived towards the ground and, instead of colliding with it, seemed to be absorbed by it. They combined, becoming an inky black mass that spread outwards, growing as though organic. From the pool of darkness, the music box arose. The headless dancer twirled, and from beneath her delicate feet, vines began to grow. From them sprouted golden leaves. They clung to every surface, taking root where they could. Alistair leapt to his feet and rushed towards the cupboard under the staircase, where old tools were stored, long since retired from use. He tugged open the door violently and grabbed the closest thing to hand, a grubby sledgehammer. His soft hands gripped the handle with purpose as his eyes fell upon the music box, the trinket his wife had held so dear. Alistair lunged toward it, raising the hammer high above his head. He swung it down with all the force his weary bones could produce. The box shattered, and the room fell silent. The vines had ceased their expansion. The dancer no longer twirled, and the branch in the painting was now without a resident. The sound of labored breathing was all that could be heard, until the telltale scuttling from behind the bricks began anew.
"You bastard! Not this time!"
Alistair cried out, enraged. He swung the sledgehammer again, aiming for what moved behind the brickwork. Each thunderous blow left a fresh hole in the stone of the old guest house. Each one seemed to be a fraction too late to stop the unseen creature. He chased the sound up the stairs and to the second-floor hallway. As he tore through the building, the doors of the rooms around him receded, disappeared as if they were never there, until only one remained, the door to room 7. He could hear the thing moving somewhere in the space beyond it. The hallway as he had known it was gone. It had morphed into a sterile white box-like room. He rattled the handle aggressively, but the door would not budge.
"I've got you now, you little fuck!"
he bellowed, sending stringy saliva spilling down his chin. Wheezing, he began to swing his hammer at the entrance to room 7. The repeated strikes made his palms numb, but he refused to stop. Finally, a split appeared in the wood. Then, with another strike, the door began to splinter. Alistair cast the hammer aside and furiously hurled himself at the barricade that stood in his way. It gave in, and he tumbled through, landing face down on the moist, pulsating ground. As Alistair raised himself from the floor, foul-smelling mucus-like fluid clung to every part of him. The 4 walls that surrounded him were made of a familiar sickly flesh, with bloody crimsons and fatty yellows. Light gradually disappeared, as the disgusting tissue expanded over the opening through which he had fallen, plunging him into darkness. For a few agonizing seconds, all was quiet, then an ear-splitting shriek as countless candles sprung to life. What appeared in the glow of the flickering flames was a distorted and broken thing. It wept loudly at the room's center. Shrill cries of anguish and torment. Countless clear tubes sprouted from its back, and through them flowed glutinous biological liquid. The monster's mouth was covered, wrapped in skin that formed a hose. The hose hung down loosely, and then ran up into the blackness above. Its eyes leaked an obsidian fluid, and yet it looked disturbingly human. It clutched the fragments of the broken music box. Alistair fell to his knees. Tears he could not understand broke free, echoing the unimaginable sorrow that overwhelmed him. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the grotesque being in front of him. He sobbed uncontrollably. "Forgive me," he pleaded, with hands clasped tightly together. It screamed out for a final time, with such force that it could have split the very sky itself. Suddenly the candle ceased to be. A bright light blinded Alistair. The doorway had reappeared. George and Sylvia Cook stood in front of him. The sledgehammer was back in his hands.
"Hey, Ellie, what are you do—"
But then his words morphed and became an unbearably deep and troubling drone.
"No, stop!"
Alistair cried, burying his head. But it was lost to that all-encompassing sound. The foundations themselves seemed to shake beneath his feet. George's arm began to blister. Then the blisters grew and merged, forming a raw-looking red lump. More blisters began to rise, this time on his face. They, too, grew to grotesque proportions, until he barely looked human at all. The strange phenomenon then spread to his wife.
"You're a part of this! You both are a part of this!"
The aging Scotsman yelled against the unstoppable noise. Tears still fell. He squeezed down hard on the hammer's handle and leapt towards the mutated creatures. Alistair ran through the dense fog, near sightless.
"I have to hide. I have to hide. I need to be where it can't find me. I can never go back there. Never again."
He wheezed to himself as he forced one flabby leg in front of the other, in spite of his heart that threatened to burst. The guest house he once knew was far behind him, and all was silent, aside from his own shuddering breaths. A large form emerged from the void ahead of him. A farmhouse. He dashed up to the front door and slammed a gelatinous fist against it.
"Hello? Is anyone in there?"
he asked, breathless. No answer. He ran for the window, but it was shattered. Behind it there was no furniture, and no sign of life. Just an old house, left in ruins.
"I can't hide here. It has walls. Walls with spaces behind them. Spaces for it to be. Spaces where it can get me,"
he rambled, still panting. Then he set off slowly behind the house to continue his search. It was then that his sights fell upon a well that lay to the house's rear.
That is perfect. It has walls with no spaces. Nowhere for it to be."
Alistair smiled widely to himself in jubilation. He sprinted over to the well with something close to a spring in his step. It had a bucket with a rope and a crank to lower it down. It was impeccable. Elated, he wound the crane, lowering the bucket down into the deep well that would be his sanctuary. It settled in the shallow water at the bottom of the shaft. Alistair lifted himself onto the stone circle, muttering to himself the whole time.
"I'll hide here until it stops looking. When it leaves, I'll be free. I can never go back to the house. Never go back there again. It knows there. It knows every inch of the place."
He took a firm hold of the rope, and with aching arms, he slowly lowered himself down. He reached the well's base with a faint splash. The freezing water came up to his knees. He gulped in great lumps of air and breathed a heavy sigh of relief.
"It can't get me down here. I'm safe."
He chuckled to himself, beaming.
"Down here I can sleep."
He lowered his soft body into the freezing water and leaned his head up against the damp stones behind him.
"Yeah, down here I can finally sleep,"
he mumbled, looking up at the hazy sky from his place below the ground. The silhouette of the rope swayed lazily to and fro, and then, with a soft click, It dropped. He watched it fall, felt the weight of the rope as it coiled up on top of him, becoming heavier as it absorbed the water. He grabbed a hold of it and held it aloft above his face, eyeing it carefully. Then he laughed. He laughed harder and longer than he had ever laughed before, reveling in the joy he felt, in the hilarity of the moment. The rope had fallen, and he could not care less. Alistair settled back down, still chuckling maniacally to himself. He got comfortable and finally closed his eyes. The moment was serene. It was silent perfection, the purest bliss. In a flash, his eyes flew open again. His pupils grew large in the low light as a familiar melody began to play.
There's always a reason to be afraid.